Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the book chats. Um, we're nearing the end of our spring semester programming, so I can be blessedly short at this point. So just two announcements. One is that the book chat we have had scheduled for next week with Faye, Mayan Ang has been canceled. Um, and then our final book chat of the season is scheduled for Wednesday, April 23rd, when I will be speaking with Alva Noe about his recent book, The Entanglement, How Art and Philosophy Make Us What We Are. And that will be our, like I said, our final book chat of the season. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Liesl Yamaguchi, professor of the Department of French, to discuss her new book on the colors of vowels, thinking through synesthesia. Professor Yamaguchi's work explores the diverse ways in which earlier visual conceptions of vowels have shaped the enigma we now call synesthesia. Joining Liesl to discuss of the colors of vowels is my chair, Eric Falchi, of the Department of English. So Liesl and Eric, we're very much looking forward to your conversation, so I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So I'm very happy to be here with Liesl. I found the book sort of marvelous and bracing and moving in a bunch of different directions at the same time that it's quite focused on this fascinating kind of conceptual entanglement. And so I thought maybe just to start to kind of invite you to just say a bit about what the book does, what it's up to, and
For sure. Thank you so much. So thanks, Stephen, for the introduction. Thanks, Eric, for being here to facilitate the discussion. Thanks, Rebecca and Michaela, for making this happen, and everyone at the Townsend. And thank all of you for being here as well. So I'm aware it takes a solid leap of faith and probably a good dose of optimism to turn up at a talk on the colors of vowels. So I want to thank you for taking that leap to be here with me today. And my goal in the next hour is not just to convince you that my topic is in fact a real one, but also to help you to see what a dazzling and fascinating one it is for anyone who is interested in poetics, in the overlap between synesthetic perception and aesthetic perception, in the interaction between the musical and verbal arts, and maybe in the history of linguistic thought, and in simpler terms, maybe just how language makes us feel. So most people have a general idea that synesthesia is a neurological condition that causes some lucky folks to respond to stimuli addressed to one sense with sensations in other senses. So seeing colors in connection with particular musical timbres, like particular musical instruments or keys or notes, tones. And while these sorts of conjunctions were pathologized as mental disturbances in the 19th century, and were certainly something no one was terribly eager to talk about, the discourses of the 20th century transformed them into signs of genius. And these particular ways of organizing sonic experience or organizing sensory experience came to be associated with genius and exceptional creativity that, quote, enabled the extraordinary compositions of people like Kandinsky or Scriabin. And this paradigm is very much the one we still live in today, but it has this funny catch in that it requires the genuine synesthetes, the privileged who see the world in a particular way or experience it in a particular way, to be clearly distinguished from the unlucky, those who don't have this special gift. But it also requires that the general public responds to the exceptional compositions, right? So that our ordinary senses are in some way sensitive to the way the extraordinary ones work. So the book, The Colors of Vowels, approaches synesthesia with this curiosity about that particular porousness between synesthetic and aesthetic perception. I look at a specific strand of the discourse because it is unmanageably broad. So I look just at the strand that connects colors with vowels as it emerges in the 19th century in medical dissertations, in poetic treatises, experimental psychology surveys, and even in the technical terminologies of linguistics and musical acoustics. So the major figures that I treat in the book are Hermann von Helmholtz, Stéphane Mallarmé, Karl Richard Lepsius, Ferdinand de Saussure, Richard Wagner, and Roman Jakobson. And what's fascinating about tracing all of these visual descriptions of vowels across 19th century discourses is twofold. So the first really salient difficulty that one comes across in doing this kind of work is the difficulty of distinguishing between literal and metaphorical usage. So when someone says bright vowels, what precisely is meant by that expression? Or even a deep red vowel. When poets talk about the colors of vowels, what particularly it's first and foremost a problem of reading. What is meant by that language? And then the second sort of salient, not difficulty, but aspect that comes out of this reading is the centrality of some kind of visual vowel color correspondence to diverse and well-known intellectual projects of the 19th century. So I'm thinking of Stéphane Mallarmé's vision of verse at the moment of the crisis of verse, that it is articulated in a way that hinges on visual properties of vowels, but also Richard Wagner's Gesamtkunstwerk, which emerges out of the tonality of vowels and Klangfarbe. The universal alphabets of 19th century phonetics, which are a colonial and domestic project to try to standardize regional pronunciation within Europe and also to grapple with the non-European languages of European empires and to submit all of the world's languages to a single set of symbols that then require a model which emerges as a color one. And even the vocalic model of structural linguistics, and that's where the project sort of veers into the 20th century with Jakobson and Saussure. So in bringing all of these discourses under the term synesthesia, the book calls into question a very prevalent, I would say even almost automatic move in the humanities, arts and humanities, which is to say that synesthesia is something that, geneticists and neuroscience, maybe cognitive linguists know something about, but not something that I know anything about or have any expertise to discuss. So that's a different thing. So I'm just going to talk about cross-sensory language or synesthetic metaphor or multi-sensory experience. And while I understand the impulse to circumscribe one's area of expertise, my fundamental argument in the book is that kind of closing off of interdisciplinary engagement and interdisciplinary reading is a bit counterproductive in this area. There are many open questions about synesthesia that scholars in the humanities, in the arts and humanities, are ideally positioned to address. So the book is trying to open up that broader inquiry into synesthesia that would include more disciplines than a simple biologizing of the subject. So thanks, Eric, I guess, for helping me open that discussion.
Well, there's so many places to go. Maybe just to pick up on the end of your remarks, one of the most interesting and complicated and just, hard thought problems of the book is just that metaphorical figurative divide. Like when, you write on page 9, when you talk about the book's central provocation, and you say by suspending the literal metaphorical divide. And so, so much of the history that I learned is, about the complicated role of impressions, figurations, metaphors, in trying to get at something. And at times and I don't know if this is right, but part of the project is almost to get behind figuration to figure out if there's kind of something there past, synesthetic metaphor or other than synesthetic metaphor. And I guess the question is where do we get, right? And it's sort of like, what do we ever leave the realm of the figurative, right? Or is that always kind of in there somehow? And I mean, you do amazing work on how we, it's really deeply baked in, the kind of problem of literal figurative. But can you say a little bit more about the difference between you know, synesthetic metaphor on the one hand, and then the kind of work that you're doing that isn't about, that pushes also away from the kind of medicalization diagnostic, right? It isn't about like someone who is synesthetic in a kind of diagnosable way.
Yeah,
Oh.
sure. So I'll begin with I'll talk about it maybe in terms of literal and metaphorical. Figured it might take me a little far afield.
Yeah.
So if you speak to most linguists, you talk about, bright and dark vowels. Those will be understood as technical terms that are entirely distinct from a synesthesia, right? They happen to be synesthetic metaphors, but when you speak about bright vowels or dark vowels, you're talking about, posterior and anterior places of resonance. You're talking about very technical aspects of sound that happen to have a metaphorical vocabulary that could be changed, right? That could be articulated in other terms. If you look at the history of those terms and the way those terms are developed in the 19th century, it actually becomes far less clear that they are in their initial development understood as strictly metaphorical. So what I'm interested in is the degree to which people who develop these terminologies are thinking in synesthetic terms or not. And so I'm less invested in this absolute divide between a genuine synesthete and a non-synesthete, because I see a lot of movement in the corpus and a lot of ambiguity between, is this a synesthetic metaphor or is this a literal, I'm claiming that this is a bright vowel. In the question of like, do we move out of the metaphorical into the literal, that is dictated by the corpus, and one has no choice because many of these writers explicitly say, I mean bright like day, I mean bright like light. And so there's an explicit evocation of visual stimulus that is equated with the property that is being claimed for what we would understand to be purely sonic. So I use the word suspending the divide because I think we're all pretty strongly trained at this point as readers to classify as like, oh, that's metaphorical language, and that is that's literal language. So this is synesthesia and this is not. But that even that distinction is a 20th century invention as far as this language is concerned, and it's an interested one. So in order for synesthesia to gain any kind of credibility as a legitimate object of inquiry about which one could make falsifiable statements, it was necessary that it be discretely defined and that it be testable, and that one could distinguish the false reporters from the real cases to be investigated. So that is, it was a productive distinction that was brought in. It was very useful for scientific purposes. It's not entirely clear that it is still useful in terms of the way it has cut up the corpus. So we've actually seen a broadening or an openness to investing what's called weak synesthesia, or the middle ground between the genuine synesthetes and the fanciful thinkers or the just mere fakers. That starts to move into the space of intuitive potential perception rather than this consistent verified experience. And the 19th century corpus is super interesting for that reason because synesthesia was coded as a disturbance or was negatively perceived. People were very hesitant to report any such experiences, which means that there were a lot of what we would now call leading questions in these questionnaires, saying like, okay, well, you don't see colors, but could O be black? No, definitely couldn't. And then people have very strong people who would say like, no, I have none of these, would have very strong opinions about like, well, E definitely can't be dark, like, which would again seem to open up this idea that like you have intuitions or you have some kind of understanding of this, and that broad understanding also would be the guarantor of a lot of synesthetic metaphor that wouldn't make sense if you couldn't carry out that kind of cross-modal translation in order to understand how the language functions.
Okay, that's really helpful and brilliant. so the kind of locus of the book is like the vowels, you know, in many ways. So I mean, both Rimbaud's poem, which you start with, and so you have a great phrase at the beginning, right at kind of in the midst of the Rimbaud reading, the variousness of vowels. Where that the poem gives us an invitation to perceive the variousness of vowels, a prism crafted to diffract their dazzling diversity, which is not just a gorgeous sentence, and it's just such a wonderfully written book, and it's a total pleasure to read. So I do go to your local bookshop. Can you talk a little bit about the role specifically of vowels here? Like, what are vowels? Why are vowels at the center of the story?
Sure. So vowels are at the center of the story because they emerge in the 19th century corpus as the most popular site for these kind of synesthetic perceptions. So they both bookend the project historically in a convenient way, in that if you're interested in sort of sound color correspondence or synesthesia in those terms, you can start with the Pythagoreans. There's no reason to have a 19th century project. What makes the 19th century distinctive is that it's the first time that vowels are implicated in the sound color correspondence, and it's much less studied than the musical correspondence between musical tones and colored tones. So vowels are a sort of convenient corner of the discourse to be looked at that hasn't been looked at very much. And a sort of historical development that's interesting in relation to that's the first chapter, is that this is also the moment in which vowels are conceived of in musical terms, or quantified in musical terms for the first time. So Hammond von Helmholtz, in the Sensations of Tone in 1863, demonstrates that vowels, what distinguishes a vowel from all other sounds, which is this ancient enigma that comes up but isn't really addressed, that the vowel is characterized by a particular balance of overtones. So there's a primary tone at which the voice is pronouncing a sound, and then the resonant cavity of the mouth what's the word I'm looking for? Causes to resonate, amplifies. There we go. Amplifies certain overtones, and that odd balance of overtones asserts a musical interval that the human ear ceases to hear as a musical interval, but instead hears as a vowel, as a signifying element of language. So there's this passage from music into language that is articulated explicitly in a scientific way in the 19th century, and it's the same time that this correspondence of color language migrates from music to language. So I was really interested both in the historical specificity of that, and just that's a fascinating way to think about poetic language and thinking about like what these poets mean when they're talking about the colors of vowels. If you bring the musical discourse to bear on that, and then you start to understand why the language of color particularly applies to assonance and rhyme, and not to meter and beats, and that it redirects our attention to particular musical aspects of poetic composition that are not served by the language of lineation, for example.
That's so maybe just to kind of keep going with that, maybe two parts of the question. Can you say more or just say more about the role of timbre in this? Yeah. Because I mean, that's one of the terms that there's 3 or 4 terms that are just kind of always kind of refiring on themselves in the book. Tone, vowel, timbre, and so timbre, just from a musical perspective, does one thing, but then the real crux of the Mallarmé chapter is what you describe as the tension of timbre. And so maybe could you talk about just the role of timbre in more generally, and then Mallarmé is always Mallarmé, but how we like what that tension of timbre is, because it's a very interesting. I mean, it seems to be quite dynamically new way to think about poetry,
Yeah.
just from that angle. So if you just kind of like
Sure.
maybe
Yeah.
mark the.
So I think it's a great question because timbre, I think, is a specifically difficult term in English. I mean, we don't actually have the word, right? So we use the French word timbre, but I think that it tends to be very vague in the minds of most of us. So and it has many definitions. The ones that are useful for us in this discussion are the timbre of an instrument is the quality of sound by which we recognize the instrument of production, right? So if you have a piano play a C major chord and you have, or even just a C, middle C, and a violin and a human voice, timbre is the quality by which you know which instrument is making the sound. Timbre also has, is applied to the human voice, right? The timbre, and then we have like interpersonal we distinguish interpersonally. So I can recognize the timbre of, Susan's voice or Layla's voice or Henry's voice based on timbre. So it's the same definition of like you recognize the instrument, but specificities within the instrument, right? The human form, but more specifically. In linguistics, we have the further distinction that timbre, the same property, but again, at a finer level of distinction, is what distinguishes one vowel from the next. So the difference between a and u is a difference of timbre, we would say. So timbre is the sign by which you recognize who made the sound or what made the sound, but it's also functioning in a way that allows us to say that the O pronounced by Michaela is the same signifying element as the O made by Claude, right? And so it's also this unifying property of sound that allows language to function, that regardless of any differences, in accordance with gender or sociolect, that you actually identify these two vowels as equivalent, as the same, and that's what enables the linguistic function, to operate. So why this matters to poetry? So timbre is where, in a very famous passage from Crise de Vers, the French poet Stéphane Mallarmé articulates the condition of possibility for poetry as a tension between the timbre that you expect, that you want in relation to a certain idea, and then the timbre that you're actually required to use in your language to express the idea. And he's very distressed that in French, if to say jour, like light or day, like that you have to use this word jour, which sounds very dark. And this is just wrong, right? It's just unfortunate. And the same is true for nuit, right? That nuit, which means night or darkness, should be very dark, and yet it's quite bright. And it's perverse, he says, which is of course not a randomly chosen word, but perverse, a perversion of verse. And then he assigns to poetry the task of making that the desired colors or brightness coincide with the linguistic sounds that you have to use to designate them. So this is in some ways a variation on a classic, poetry is the place where sound and sense are made to coincide or given the impression that they coincide, or Valéry's definition of the poem as this prolonged hesitation between the sound and the sense. But in any case, it's another way of articulating this relation between different strata of languages, right? Of a phonic level and a semantic level. And it resides on a shared property between them that can be made to coincide in poetic language and in poetic language alone. And I don't think it's one, and so those are very familiar definitions of poetry, but not ones that have been talked about in relation particularly to vowel timbre and coloration. They usually have more to do with the division of rhythmic sequences and temporality and meter. And so this is particularly exciting historically in terms of the history of poetry, because this is the moment of meter's decline. And if meter is on the decline, what sort of definition of poetry is possible if we're giving up that kind of segmentation? And so through the question of timbre, he opens up another potential definition of a linguistic tension that would be proper to poetry or specific to verse, and yet not reliant explicitly on meter.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, and it's, yeah, and Keats talks about a similar kind of vowel, kind of vowel leading, where it's all based on the kind of vowel work, right? I don't know if this is going to be a dumb question, but it might be a dumb question. So clearly, so when we think about synesthesia as a, I mean, the way I want to ask it is sort of like, is it meaningful to say a poem can be synesthetic? If so, like, where does that attach? Like, does it attach at the site of composition? I mean, I would imagine that one thing that has happened in the kind of is, trying to determine if so-and-so author, painter, artist from the past was or was not synesthetic. And so there's that, is there, and whereas Mallarmé, it's a kind of compositional, it's a continual kind of condition of compositional possibility to produce this tension. So does it attach, is it a feature of a text? Is it something like, how does the reader fit in?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I think usually when people say it's a synesthetic poem, they're thinking of like correspondence or Sappho, these classics that assert some kind of correspondence between different sensory modes. So it's a thematic that comes up in a lot of poetry. But in Mallarmé's definition, it actually has more to do with a recorded his own experience of language, which is amply attested both in Crises de Vers, but throughout the correspondence and in the Les mots anglais. But it relies on a belief, a faith that their reader will respond to the language in the same way, right? So Mallarmé he's annoyed that jour and nuit are mismatched, but it never occurs to him that anyone would hear nuit as dark or jour as bright, right? It's very obvious. Of course, everyone perceived it to be this way, which is quite consistent, I have to say, across these experiences. When you read them, people generally have, were under the impression that everyone saw the way that they did. Remind me of,
I
lost
or like, kind of the synesthesia, like as a,
the reader response, yes. So it relies on an idea that the readership is going to have a similar experience of the linguistic sounds that the poet has. And one of the clearest illustration of this in the book is so Mallarmé makes these famous claims in Crises de Vers about jour and nuit being like dark and bright. And you do sort of see correspondence between those claims and the experimental psychology surveys that come out over basically like the same decade, that this is actually the one area in which mostly people are in agreement. One of the difficulties of this material, famously, that makes it interesting is that the colors basically don't agree. So if you're looking for an intersubjective validity, people who report synesthetic experiences disagree in a very impassioned way about which vowels have which colors. The degrees of brightness and darkness and the mapping onto anteriority and posteriority in terms of pronunciation is much more agreed upon. And you see this in actually coming out in the poetry in Le Vierge, le Vivace, le Bel Aujourd'hui, which is one of Mallarmé's poems that's famously called the symphony in white, because it's about a swan in a frozen lake, and the palette is entirely white, and that's very clear. But also all of the vowels of the rhymes of the sonnet are variations on the timbre of I. So it's this sort of perfect poetic realization of this idea of kind of a whiteout or a brightout in both the sound and the sense. So that's the clearest illustration, but it's sort of peppered throughout the corpus. You can see this. The A being the most chromatic vowel, again, both in linguistics and then in Mallarmé's imaginary of Hérodiade, this vowel would be rouge comme une grenade ouverte, Hérodiade, which also he sort of aligns the rhyme of grenade to emphasize that particular vowel.
I want to be mindful of the time. Maybe another question or two before we towards the there's some wonderful kind of concluding. Okay, I guess I comes from two questions that kind of take you into the later chapters. The book is very focused in kind of the 19th century French, and you give a really interesting account of why that is, and also why kind of there's an 1812, there's a dissertation in 1812 that starts this off. Could you talk a little bit about just why it is that the 19th century is kind of the space to begin here. And I guess the other thing that it would be great to hear you talk about, like this all inflects in a particular way, obviously because it's being routed in some ways through Mallarmé, it all comes to bear on Wagner in a kind of interesting way about what he's thinking about with the Gesamtkampf's work and it takes us back to vowels because of his annoyance with European opera at the time had everything to do with kind of, or a lot to do with how vowels were being sung. Could you, I mean, and maybe either one, like if you, either like why, what do you make of this kind of like 1812 starting point and then to where we are now with a kind of largely medicalized discourse that you want to kind of push against? Or like, what's Wagner doing? What's Wagner doing here?
They're both really interesting questions, so I'll try to do them both in succinct ways. So why the 19th century? So my suspicion of historical novelty is kind of why the 19th century, that the history of the neurosciences has really identified this 1812 text as the first articulate, recognizable case of synesthesia. And in fact, not just vowel-color synesthesia, although it's there, but of any synesthesia that's recognizable in the modern scientific paradigm. But you will also find throughout the scientific corpus that every indication would be that this is not a new phenomenon, but this is how humans have been experiencing the world for as long as there have been humans, and possibly before that, because synesthesia disrupts a human, non-human distinction and is attested in other life forms. And this is quite threatening to some, Max Nordau, and quite exciting to others, Claude Lévi-Strauss, but in any case, is not limited to the human. And so that's an odd state of affairs, right? That we have this condition, but we don't have a history to it. The reason the 19th century emerges as the beginning of a history has to do with, I mean, it's not a happenstance that it's a medical dissertation that is recognizable to, scientists as a record. So it has to do with the codification of the ways in which it's recorded as the list of correspondences, but unorganized synesthesia could well be manifest earlier than that if you knew how to read for it or how to find it in the language, which is sort of my argument about what scholars in the humanities and poetics and literature in general are able to perceive in a way that we couldn't expect, other colleagues to know how to do that reading. And so the project is about finding the way of reading and the terms by which this extends way beyond the 19th century, if we knew how to read it. And so like Rousseau is one of the essay on the discourse on the origin of language that has the discussion of vowel nuance. And so that is maybe my segue into Wagner, sort of why Wagner. The Wagner is really interesting because I did the Helmholtz much earlier, and Helmholtz is the one who quantifies vowels in terms of the musical overtones, and talks about this subtle melody that he can hear when going through the vowel sounds. So and you see this scattered here and there in some of these really old texts, that if you pronounce all the vowels and you move between them, one, it's very hard to distinguish them, that they seem to need some kind of oppositionality for us to know which vowel we are dealing with. But then if you just move from one vowel to the next, so you can sort of hear a melody in the vowels, that you can actually hear those formants. You can like very subtly hear a melodic line. And then Helmholtz sort of triumphantly says, it's really there, like it's a real thing, and I can demonstrate it with my resonators, which is indeed very exciting. I was very excited. But then later in my work, when I was reading Wagner and writing, about 15 years earlier, like 1851, not even 15 years earlier, in opera and drama, this is his point of departure for the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is intent on having an organic art that would not so much combine all of the existing art forms as precede their separation and distinction. And the point of departure for that is the vowel, because it's where music and dramatic verse, or poetry, are still undivided, is the vowel. And that there's this sort of melody in the vowels that if you were aware of that when you're composing the dramatic verse, it would dictate a certain kind of musical composition. And so if you want to create this organic work in which the verbal arts and the musical arts would be united for a particular force in a particularly forceful way, you would have to start with that melody and be conscious of that melody, and in composing the dramatic verse and orchestrating outward from there for the whole opera. And so, I had this amazing moment of like, whoa, what, like Wagner knew what Helmholtz proved in a way, which was very much the structure of a lot of the work, that it would be articulated in a very scientific way, but then you could see what was being identified much earlier in many of the other sort of forms of knowledge or artistic expressions. Yeah, did I answer both?
No, that was great. That was great. We have just about 15 minutes left, and so maybe we should open up for questions from the floor. There will be a mic that comes around, and I think the recording won't pick you up unless you have the mic. So just wait until you get the mic to ask your question. Yes.
Thank you so much, Liesl. This was really interesting. And I have a question that is maybe silly or stupid, but obviously your book's about vowels, but I can't help but wonder what you came across while you're researching the book about consonants. And also I was thinking about, it doesn't seem accidental that you're talking about French poetry a lot with this, because if like in Germanic poetic traditions prior to modernity, I guess, like the consonant is really important, more important than vowel rhyme, right? Like in Anglo-Saxon poetry, it's consonance is the most important feature. So I'm really curious, like, do you think it would be, if you had a different corpus, and you were looking at different traditions, would it have been a different book? I mean, obviously it would have been, obviously, but you know what I mean? Like, what's your sense about that?
Yeah, so consonants do appear a lot as these coloring agents. So chapter 2 of the book is called The Interaction of Color, and is, to me, one of the most fascinating parts of it, because as we study synesthesia now, there's an isolated stimulus, and actually definitional to synesthesia. In order to get into the corpus of data, you have to be very consistent. So you report the same colors with the vowels. Before the isolated stimulus and the consistency criterion emerged, basically in the 20th century, you have many accounts with inconsistency based on consonantal context. Which would also be sort of prosodic and poetic context. So people will say, like, well, like A is reddish, but then, or like, F is reddish, but then if you pronounce the name F, it's sort of orange, because you have this yellow force of the E that is required for the pronunciation of the F. And so there's this like delicate color play going on in many of the reports that quickly disappears in the 20th century, but that talks about consonants as coloring agents, particularly in relation to sort of how they shape the passage of air. And the easiest way to get through this material, just in a blunt way, is like, the more air, the more light, like air light, like the passage of air is giving us, which also sort of motivates this brightness of vowel with a divinity and a brightness of light that we also is sort of shot through the corpus. So consonants are very present in terms of how they color the vowels, but the vowels emerge from this particular corpus as at least what people are most often reporting as the locuses of color, but not exclusively. Consonants are really present, and then in Jakobson's model, He also has the maximum chromaticity, like consonants and vowels are not separated so much as they're kind of all on one extension of intensity, with the most chromatic being the ah and the least chromatic being because it has the least easy passage of air. And the slide from vowels to semivowels and consonants is one continuum with maximum chromatism with the vowels, which is why the consonants are less present. Stabreim, though, is really important for Wagner's conception of, like, so he, the coloring consonants, as he calls them, need to be discerningly arranged so that, the vowel melody will be right, or the vowel colors will be right. It's the Klangfarbe of the voice. And then if the Klangfarbe of the voice is correct, with its sort of changeable colors in relation to the consonants, then you can orchestrate the timbres of the orchestral Klangfarbe to accord with that in an organic way. I should have mentioned that Klangfarbe is the German translation of timbre and literally means sound color. Sorry.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
What are your thoughts about variation among synesthetes where, like, with a given vowel, one synesthete might perceive one musical tone, another synesthete might perceive a completely different musical tone. What are your thoughts about how that affects our understanding of synesthesia, or whether there can be sort of a collective understanding or appreciation of synesthesia?
Thanks. Also a great question, one that I was hoping to address earlier, so thank you for that. So this is one of the bears of synesthetic research, is why is there not more agreement across subjects? And this is it's a very frustrating, I don't have an answer to that question, but the way I've made that question more attractive or more interesting is, rather than to focus on, like, do the colors match, which is basically how that question is posed, is, do the colors interact in similar ways? Are there patterns of behavior in terms of various variables like, luminosity or darkness, but also in the ways that they interact in relation to context. So instead of asking, like, does everyone think that I is bright? Saying, well, if the I has a T before it, is it systematically perceived as darker? And this is why this is what the poetic corpus, I think, is really useful for, because there is a very attentive and nuanced discussion of how the rhyme is coloring the line, or how these sounds, and in vocal performance as well, right? That singers struggle to produce certain vowels at certain pitches if they're preceded by particular consonants and things like this. So I don't have an answer to your question about the lack of agreement, but I am quite fascinated by the agreement in the ways, the behavior of the movement of the associations that show much more agreement. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Kind of a follow-up on that question. My family and I play this game that my sister invented, in which we do something with numbers. It's called brainwaves, where we're trying to, like, associate a vibe to a number in categories. And what we've found is that as the game progresses, a brainwave develops, and it becomes like this, where we'll just know the number without, like, too many categories needing to be asked.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's been research or history of synesthetes' perceptions becoming more aligned the closer their relationship is, or the more time they spend together?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. So, I mean, the classic text that kind of comes to mind is Nabokov on Speak Memory, because he discovers that he does sort of organize letters this way when playing with colored blocks, and because he discovers that his mother has the same thing, but different ones. Like, they don't agree on which colors they should be, and neither of their colors match the colors on the block. So it's like a three-way argument between the blocks, the mother and Nabokov. So you know, the degree to which though, like if we're in the discourse of like the genuine synesthetes, those agree, basically no. However, if we're talking about sort of the linguistic or cultural ways that we have these associations and how those change over time, that, you know, we think of blue as, you know, masculine or as calming, but, you know, blue once was like the color of evil and things like this. Those associations can certainly be and have been studied in very historically precise ways. What I think is sort of one of the central interesting things about the colors of vowels in these discourses that I have studied is that they very much defy the two main ways of discounting, what I would call like discounting synesthesia. So one is to explain away the phonic level, the tension between the phonic and the semantic, by saying that it's just a semantic association. Like you think that light sounds bright because you've heard people saying light your whole life. So like in English, you think that. And so it's language specific, and it's essentially just a learned like acquisition. If that were the case, however, like we would never be surprised by jour and nuit being misaligned. Also, the presence of the same letters in words of opposite meaning would seem to pose something of a problem. The second way of sort of dismissing or effacing the question is to discuss these sensations as purely personal. So, you know, it's like, well, you think O is yellow because you had a book in which O had like, you know, the yellow and the bumblebee or whatever it was. And so it's, again, this learned thing. What emerges from actually pretty much all of the chapters of the book is that the color model in relation to vowels seems to point not to one sort of personal lexicon, nor to one specific language like English or French, but to some idea of language as like a universal, supreme or divine language that would be the same for all, or that by which all languages are considered a single category, and that universal language would have particular qualities, would have particular colors, and they would all be the same. So that structure, whether it's understood as imaginary or whether it's understood as real, is in all cases understood to be sort of language capital L rather than particular idioms. And it's necessary to someone like Mallarmé's conception of verse that is the language to which the verse is aspiring, and not French, but in fact to this supreme language. But it's as necessary to that idea of poetry as it is to, you know, the universal phonetic alphabets, which are very much a scientific project and have this idea of like, we need to model all of the potential vowels that the human apparatus can possibly articulate and anticipate ones that we haven't even encountered in languages that we have yet to decipher. And we need a model for that. And so that universal symbolism, like what could we how could we render this visually or graphically, or even conceive of this model? Ah, I have it, color, right? So it's the universal, which, you know, is always, I stress, like an imaginary construction that is necessary to use the model.
I guess maybe one more question, it seems.
I've got a, thanks, Liesl. So you're a very prolific translator, and you've had to deal with the problem of translating lots of sociolects. And I'm just wondering, in your own experience, to what extent does your immersion in synesthesia come into play? I mean, does this cross your mind as you are translating, thinking in terms of vowel color as a factor as you are distinguishing among sociolects as you're translating them?
That is luckily an easy question. No. Sorry, Rick. No, it's a great question, but no. So we have time for another.
Yeah, well, another question.
Yeah, I had a question. I'm not super familiar with this field because I'm not like a rhetoric or English major, but I'm like a cog sci major, so there's some relation there. I suppose one of the things I was intrigued about was like the construction of like iambic pentameter by Shakespeare and how that relates with the fact that like we do have 5 vowel sounds and the interplay between those two in in sort of evoking certain ideas in poetry, certain colors or textures in poetry?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's not one I had thought about because I don't really write about English poetry in the book, and I'm not sure. Is there any kind of correspondence between like the number of vowels that are commonly perceived as existing in a language and the dominant meters of the language? Maybe Eric has insight into this.
Well, I mean, I think it's a question that we've kind of like, what would this look like? Because I mean, the book is, it does point to this kind of these moments of like aspiration, like with Mallarmé, like part of the tension of timbre is that it hasn't met, it's failed to meet this sense of the supreme, right? So it's in the space of loss, and then sort of what that tension would look like in other languages. And I was thinking, if we had another 4 or 5 hours, like, what does it matter that, or how does it matter that, the kind of lack of certain kinds of stress in French produces a certain set of thoughts, whereas say in English, you went back to the kind of alliterative Old English verse, like what would that, like the role of the vowel, but I never thought about it in terms of like how many vowel sounds does a language kind of have at its disposal.
Yeah, and I guess I more so is relating it to like the notion of like how like iambic pentameter goes with sort of the regular flow of like an English sentence per se, and how that is useful, I suppose.
Well, it depends. I mean, we have many linguists in the room, or at least in terms of like Kristen, yes,
Kristen, you're on.
there she is. In terms of the number of spoken vowels in English, which I'm not a specialist, but one of the interesting things about the Rimbaud sonnet is he lists off the vowels that are that French school children learn like in school basically, but it doesn't include all of the written vowels of French, nor all of the vowels that are necessary to the language. It's just sort of the child's understanding, and then it's projected into the long history of vowels by bracketing itself with O and omega, and so violating the normal order of A, E, I, O, U, and ending with the O, the omega, I am alpha and omega, and right, it becomes this sort of like oracular utterance or a divine utterance. So for English, I hesitate to make any pronouncements because I don't know actually how many vowels we have in English, but I suspect it's more than the 5 that we learn in school.
Well, the bell tolled. So I just want to thank you, Liesl, for such a wonderful book. Thank you all for being here.
Yes, thank you.